Now that we have dealt with prelims related article, let us now move to the main centric articles. And the first article in our mains related discussion, it is on the issue of monetary policy. Because monetary policy committee which deals with monetary policy, it is likely to meet from December 6th to 8th, and this monetary policy committee it is more likely to leave the repo rate unchanged. Now, why are we dealing with Monetary Policy Committee and its decisions? Because UPSC paper 3 it highlights the issues related to Indian economy and issues related to growth. Further, a question previously, especially in the mains of the year 2019, it asked us a question related to steady GDP growth and low inflation. Now, RBI, that is the Central Bank of India, it controls the supply of money in the Indian economy. And this control of supply of money, it is known as a monetary policy. Now, what is this control of supply of money? It is intended to do. Now, monetary policy by any bank in general, it has two effects. First of all, it is aimed to control inflation, and also this amount of money supply in economy it can also have implications on the levels of economic growth. Now, this is the two aims that a monetary policy wants to achieve, and how this aim is achieved. It is through the control of money supply. Now you know that monetary policy it involves controlling, that is increasing or decreasing the money supply in an economy. Now a natural question it might appear in your head that what is this monetary policy and who decides on this monetary policy? Now what this discussion it is aimed to do is that it will tell you about what, why and how this monetary policy and its objectives are achieved. And this discussion it will help you aspirants determine and understand the future articles on this monetary policy. Further, this topic it is also very important not just from mains but also from prelims point of view. Hence, please stick to this discussion if you want to know more about what are monetary policy and its implications on the Indian economy. Now, as I was saying, this monetary policy or who or which body in India it decides on monetary policy. Now, in this regard, the RBI Act of 1934 it gives the responsibility of controlling the money supply, that is deciding on the monetary policy of India on the central bank, that is Reserve Bank of India. Now, this monetary policy framework it was given an institutional design through amendment of this act in the year 2016. Now, this amendment act it introduced section 45 ZA to the RBI Act of 1934, and this act it stated that RBI it should specifically focus on controlling the inflation in the Indian economy. Hence, from this slide, you can understand that out of two objectives, that is controlling inflation and achieving a desired level of economic growth, this amendment it wanted RBI to focus more on controlling the inflation in an economy. Then, now a question might appear: how will RBI control inflation? Now, this particular amendment it added that RBI it should monitor the consumer price index, which highlights the level of inflation in Indian economy. Now, what should be the ideal percentage of this consumer price index that the RBI should aim to achieve? In this regard, both government as well as RBI it got together and it decided that RBI should focus on controlling the inflation up till 4% of consumer price index. However, Government and RBI, it also decided that this inflation target should be flexible in nature. Thereby, and the government issued a notification stating that RBI should undertake policy recommendations based on controlling the inflation as per 4% with an upper and lower tolerance level of 2%. Therefore, currently RBI wants to control the inflation in India from 2% up till 6%. Now, how RBI decides on how to control the inflation in India? Now, the section 45 ZB of the RBI Act, it was added, especially this section, through this 2016 amendment, and it formulated or provided the constitution of Monetary Policy Committee. And in this committee, it included 6 members. And these 6 members, they will meet periodically to decide on what kind of policy actions should RBI take in order to control the inflation between this particular bracket. Now, this 6 members of Monetary Policy Committee, it consists of Governor of RBI, Deputy Governor of RBI, who is in charge of monetary policy, as well as Officer of RBI, who is appointed by the Central Board of RBI itself. Further, this Monetary Policy Committee, it also consists of 3 experts who are experts in economy, and these experts, they are appointed by the government of India. Now, as I've already highlighted that RBI, it wanted to control or it should control the inflation between the bracket of 2% as well as 6%. And if the RBI, it is unable to maintain the inflation between this bracket, it constitutes the failure of Monetary Policy Committee. Now you'll ask, if an inflation it goes more than 6% or less than 2% in one quarter, will it constitute a failure of Monetary Policy Committee? The answer is no. Because as per this amendment, the failure of Monetary Policy Committee will only be when the inflation is less than 2% or more than 6% for 3 consecutive quarters. Hence, if inflation is more than 6% or less than 2% for 3 consecutive quarters, it will constitute a failure of Monetary Policy Committee. And if there's a failure of Monetary Policy Committee, this Monetary Policy Committee, it will submit a report to the Union government stating the reasons for its failure, as well as it will provide what kind of remedial measures that the Monetary Policy Committee should take. Further, this report will also consist of a definite time period within which the RBI expects the inflation to come under this particular bracket. Now, what is the process of deciding this monetary policy decisions? First of all, the schedule of Monetary Policy Committee meetings, it is decided on a yearly basis. And a notice when a meeting should happen, it is generally given at a advance of 15 days. However, the RBI Act, it also provides that this notice in a case of emergency, it can also be provided on the basis of 24 hours. Further, at the time the meeting is happening, the members of Monetary Policy Committee, they go through various surveys which are conducted by RBI. For example, RBI gauges the consumer confidence of the Indian consumers, as well as it also calculates the expectation of inflation that a particular Indian household might have. Further, these RBI surveys, it also consists of various type of corporate sector performances or credit conditions in the Indian economy. Hence, this survey, it gives the RBI or the Monetary Policy Committee members an overview of what kind of an inflation that Indian economy is currently going through. Hence, By going through these reports, the Monetary Policy Committee members, they came up with their decision. And this decision, it is called as a Monetary Policy Committee's resolution. Now, this resolution, it is announced by the Monetary Policy Committee on a bi monthly basis. Sorry, once in 2 months. Now, this monetary policy decision, it is conveyed in a form of resolution. And this resolution, it is based on majority of what kind of members feel. And if there's a tie in the decisions of Monetary Policy Committee, then the casting vote, it is on the hands of RBI governor. Now, 14 days after the resolution is passed, this announced the minutes of meeting of this Monetary Policy Committee. And this minutes, it consists of views of each and every member of this Monetary Policy Committee, and it highlights what kind of members are expecting or giving a decision. Further, once every 6 months, this Monetary Policy Committee, it also comes out with a policy report. And this policy report, it determines or it explains the expected level of inflation in the economy. Further, it also gives projections of future inflation as well as assessment of the state of Indian economy. Now, you'll ask, why was there a need to constitute a monetary policy? Shouldn't the monetary policy should be in the sole hands of the governor himself, or should a committee which consists of multiple members, they should decide on the monetary policy decisions? Now, there are several implications of constituting a monetary policy. First of all, that this decision of RBI, it constitutes views of multiple members and not just one member. Further, there's also a decentralization of responsibility, which spreads the responsibility from one person to certain members, thereby reducing the pressure on an individual. Further, this committee, it will also ensure a level of continuity in the monetary policy's decision should a member is changed in between. Now, now that we have addressed what is monetary policy, let us now understand how is the monetary policy changed and what are the tools that are utilized for distributing or undertaking these monetary policy changes. Now, there are various instruments with the RBI that are responsible for controlling the money supply in the economy. Now, the first two instruments, they are known as statutory requirements that every bank should have. For example, for every 100 rupees that are deposited to the bank should keep out or separate some kind of funds for its reserve requirements. For example, there's a cash reserve ratio. And this cash reserve ratio means that the scheduled commercial banks, they should take out some money from their net deposits and they should keep this money with the RBI itself in form of cash. And this is known as cash reserve ratio. Now, naturally, this cash reserve ratio, it is about 3 to 4%. And I'm just using this as an example. Now, out of every 100 rupees, the RBI, for example, it might say that a bank is required to have a 4% cash to reserve ratio. Hence, this means that out of every 100 deposits in the bank, it should separate rupees 4 as its cash reserve requirement and it should deposit this rupees 4 with the RBI itself. Further, there is also another statutory requirement which is known as statutory liquidity ratio. For example, if the RBI, it says that the bank should have a statutory liquidity ratio of 20%. And this means that out of every 100 rupees that are deposited to the bank, the bank will maintain a 20 rupees statutory liquidity ratio. Now, there's a separation or a difference between this CRR as well as SLR. Whereas on the other hand, the requirement of CLR, it should be kept with RBI and it should be kept in form of cash. Whereas on the other hand, This SLR or statutory liquidity requirement, this requirement it should be kept in various forms such as cash, government securities as well as gold. Whereas who keeps this particular SLR? As this SLR it is kept with the banks themselves. Hence you can see that out of every 100 rupees, 4 rupees are there for CRR ratio, whereas 20 rupees are there for SLR ratio. Thereby, by increasing the CLR or SLR, the RBI it can reduce the amount of money that a bank could engage or use the money for its lending purposes. Thereby, rupees 24 out of every 100 deposit, it is taken out by the RBI for its liquidity or its reserve requirements. Thereby, the banks can now only utilize 76 rupees for their lending purposes. Hence, in order to reduce the liquidity, what the government or the RBI will do is that it will increase the reserve ratio requirement. Whereas on the other hand, if the RBI it wants to increase the money supply in the economy, it will reduce the statutory liquidity ratio or the CRR. Now further, RBI also undertakes lending to banks because RBI it is a banker of Indian banks and it engages in lending through four instruments, the first of which it is known as repo rate. As utilizing this repo rate, RBI it lends money to banks. While on the other hand, banks which lend money from the RBI, they pay interest based on this repo rate. And in return, what banks do is that they give government securities as a collateral. Now, this lending it can happen when banks want more liquidity. Hence, you can understand by increasing the repo rate, the RBI it can make the lending for bank a more costly affair. And naturally, if banks are getting money by more interest rate, they will again lend this money at higher rates, which will again make the lending or loans more costlier in an economy. Now, the reverse, it happens in the case of reverse repo rate because banks they deposit money with RBI using this reverse repo rate because it is the rate which RBI offers the bank if they deposit their money with the RBI. And naturally, RBI provides these banks with government securities as collateral. And this instrument in particular, it is used to absorb the excess liquidity by the banks because RBI, by increasing the reverse repo rate, will make the deposits of bank to the RBI more attractive. Hence, by increasing the repo rate, the RBI it will suck out the excess liquidity with the banks, thereby reducing the money supply in an Indian economy. Now, what happens if the RBI it does not want to provide government securities to the banks? Because there are many cases, especially when the liquidity in an Indian economy it is quite high. And in this regard, in the year 2020 itself, RBI came out with a standing deposit facility. And as this facility, it enabled the RBI to suck out the excess liquidity of the banks without providing them with a government security in return. Now, this SDF rates, it is 0.25% less than the repo rate. Now, there's also another penal rate which is known as marginal standing facility. Because using this marginal standing facility, the banks it can borrow money from the RBI. Now, as I've already highlighted that statutory liquidity ratio, it provides that banks should have a certain level of government securities as well. And naturally, these government securities they cannot be utilized in providing collateral for this repo rate or reverse repo rate transactions. But what happens if a bank it wants to borrow money utilizing this SLR government securities? Hence, the banks it can also borrow money using these kind of government securities which are there for SLR requirement, and the banks it will be required to pay a 0.25% premium over and above repo rate. Hence, utilizing these four measures, the RBI it states that it can control the money supply in an Indian economy. And these four tools they are known as liquidity adjustment facility. Now, what are the open market operation? As I've already highlighted, the RBI it controls the level of money supply in an economy. Hence, if RBI it decides to sell government securities in the market or to banks, it will lead. Hence, what RBI does is that it sells government securities to banks and then it asks banks to deposit them with cash. Hence, if the RBI it decides to sell government securities and it decides to deposit the excess cash, it will reduce the money supply in economy. Whereas on the other hand, if RBI decides to buy government securities, it will have to provide banks with cash. And this excess cash will increase the money supply. Hence, using the amount of open market operations, what the RBI can do is that it can increase or decrease the level of money supply in an Indian economy. Now, what is this bank rate? If a bank, especially our scheduled commercial banks, if they fail to maintain this SLR or CRR ratio, then they can borrow money from the RBI to fulfill this requirement. However, this money it will be available to them at a higher interest rate, which is known as bank rate. Hence, now you've understood that RBI it controls the money supply through cash reserve ratio and statutory requirement ratio, whereas on the other hand, it also controls the money supply using repo rate, reverse repo rate, as well as standing deposit facility, as well as marginal standing facility. Now, after we have discussed what are the tools of monetary supply, let us understand what is the policy stance of an RBI. Now, generally, every monetary policy committee's resolution it comes up with two kinds of data. First of all, it says what is the policy rate, which is usually the repo rate. Because if RBI increases the repo rate, it will decrease the money supply in an economy. Whereas on the other hand, if RBI reduces the repo rate, it will increase the money supply. But this monetary policy committee's resolution it also highlights what is the stance of RBI or what the market should expect from future decisions of RBI. As this stance, it provides guidance to the market and also it helps the market to determine or to understand what the future course of action of the RBI will be. First of all, RBI it says that its policy stance is accommodative. Now, what is this accommodative policy stance? For example, if the RBI it is prepared to expand its money supply, therefore it will highlight that its or its policy stance is accommodative in nature. And when is RBI more likely to expand its money supply? Especially when the amount of inflation in an economy is low and the RBI it wants to promote economic growth, then it will or it is more likely to expand the money supply in the future. Whereas if the RBI is certain or uncertain whether it will increase or decrease the repo rate, then the RBI it will highlight that its policy stance is neutral, because in future decisions RBI it may increase or decrease this repo rates. Whereas on the other hand, if RBI highlights that its policy stance is hawkish, it means that RBI or the Indian economy it is currently witnessing high levels of inflation. And by hawkish policy stance, the RBI it will highlight that it will increase the repo rate in its future decisions. Further, if RBI says that its policy stance is that of calibrated tightening, it means that RBI will increase its repo rate based on the demands of an economy. However, there's also another fact about this calibrated tightening. And with this stance, the RBI it might highlight that its tightening of monetary policy, that is increasing of repo rate, will be more gradual in nature. Hence, you can say that there are mostly four types of policy stance that are utilized by RBI to signify its future decisions. Now, after we have dealt with what is monetary policy and how is monetary policy decisions undertaken, let us understand why is there a need for monetary policy. Because monetary policy, as I've already highlighted, it wants to either control inflation or promote growth. Now, in the previous slide, I highlighted that the responsibility of RBI is mainly to control the inflation because RBI it adopted an inflation targeting method. Because because of the changes to the monetary policy, RBI now targets this consumer price index and it wants to keep this consumer price index between the levels of 6 to 2%. And this particular measure it is called as flexible inflation targeting. Now, why is RBI adopting this kind of policy measure? Naturally, because this policy measure has some kind of benefits. The first benefit is that it provides the market with a transparent action. Because if RBI it states that there's a certain corridor between which it wants to keep the country's inflation, it will bring more transparency in its day to day action. And in addition, it will also bring more clarity as well as predictability in its future decisions. Because if RBI is able to clarify and the market is able to predict its future decision, it will help stabilize the Indian economy. Further, if there's a high inflation in the domestic market, it will eventually lead to decreasing purchasing power or decreasing the levels of employment. Hence, naturally, any government will not want to undertake this kind of decisions. Thereby, in order to control inflation, RBI has adopted this inflation targeting. Because of stable inflation in an economy, it will promote the conditions which favors economic growth. Because if the level of inflation in a country is moderate, especially between 2 and 6%, it will promote investors to encourage or take investment decisions. Hence, by stabilizing the inflation in the country, what RBI wants to do is that it wants to promote economic growth in the country. Further, as I've already highlighted, RBI it solely decides on how or what should be the policy rate of India's monetary policy. Thereby, it means that RBI has been given complete autonomy based on inflation targeting method. However, this particular inflation targeting method it also makes RBI accountable to the government. Because if RBI is unable to maintain the inflation between these ranges, it has to submit a report to the government explaining why it was failing or what measures it might undertake in order to control country's inflation. Further, there was empirical evidence in most western economies, especially with that of United Kingdom as well as New Zealand, because these economies they first undertook this inflation targeting method. And with this method, these countries they were able to stabilize the level of inflation in the economy. Thereby, RBI in the year 2016 it also adopted the method of inflation targeting. However, there are also some drawbacks of this inflation targeting method. The first drawback is that, as I've already highlighted, monetary policy measures they have two key goals: the inflation, whereas on the other hand, this monetary policy it can be also utilized to promote growth in the economy. However, if the RBI it is solely focused on inflation targeting, it will disregard the other roles that the RBI is expected to play. For example, the RBI it should also want to undertake increased level of economic growth. And if the RBI it solely focuses on inflation targeting, then this role of promoting the economic growth will take a secondary role. Further, prior to the inflation targeting setup, most of the countries they were able to understand that with price stability in an economy, it will lead to financial stability in an economy. And this was true up till the year of 2008. However, post 2008, what we saw that world was undertaken by the global financial crisis, because most of the western economies, especially United States, what they focus more on price stability through this inflation targeting method. However, the banks, especially the central banks of US, they were able to undertake the specific discharge of their duties, especially with relation to its lending roles. And because of increased lending, what we saw that the ballooning of balance sheet of banks took place, which led to this global financial crisis. Further, the RBI's former governor, who was D. Subbarao, he also highlighted that if a bank specially focus on price stability, it will lead to financial instability in the longer run. Further, what we witnessed that due to increased inflation targeting and a specific focus of the RBI to control the inflation, it led to higher policy rates. And this policy rates, that is higher policy rates, it led to slower economic growth in India. For example, before pandemic, especially in the especially in the year of 2019 to 20, what India saw was slow economic growth because its GDP growth in the last quarter of 2019-10 it reached only till 5%. Further, this period it also witnessed higher unemployment rate, especially 6.1% of unemployment rate. And this slow economic growth in India, especially during the year of 2019 to 20, it was attributed solely because of increased policy rates by the RBI. Because this increased policy rate, it discouraged lending as well as it removed the liquidity which is very much essential for functioning of an economy. Further, inflation targeting it is very much effective in advanced economies because these advanced economies they have high monetary policy transmission, and this transmission it means that the policy decisions of a central bank it is then undertaken in an equal manner by the banks. However, on the other hand, especially in India, what we witness is the monetary policy transmission in the country is very poor, and this can be highlighted by an example. Because since May 2022, RBI it has increased 250 points of its policy rates. However, this 250 basis points increase in policy rate it only resulted into 152 basis points increase in the bank's lending rate. Hence, we can say that the transmission of this policy measure it is ineffective as far as lending rates of the banks are concerned. Sorry. Further, this inflation targeting it also witnesses, and this measure it specifically deals when the demand side of inflation is more. For example, if there's an increased level of money supply in an economy, it will create more and more demand. And when government or the RBI it reduces the money supply, it will reduce the demand in an economy. However, India it also witnesses what are known as supply side inflation. For example, if there's an increase in prices of tomato, onion or potato, and this price it might increase because the productivity of these crops are low, and this kind of inflation it is called as supply side inflation. However, naturally, RBI being the central bank, it is not responsible for controlling the supply or productivity of Indian agriculture. Hence, you can say that RBI's inflation targeting method it is unable to deal with the supply side inflation as it only deals with the demand side inflation. Hence, the inflation targeting in an economy it should be more flexible in nature. Further, the central bank it should also focus on not just controlling inflation but should also promote the economic growth in an economy because both these factors are essential for a macroeconomic stability. Hence, this was all for